Good day, this is Terry Difazio, and you're watching Dial It Up. Today, my guest is former State Senator Vince Illuzzi. It's good to have you on the show, Vince. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Well, it's nice to see you, Terry. It's good to be back. I certainly had an interest in the station a few years ago when I served on the board of directors, and it was a great experience. It was fun working with you and Todd and the rest of the team.
Yeah, we hope you'll visit the place more often because we're always making vast improvements, and we've got some new improvements coming up. So yeah, we're always trying to take the place forward.
I like your Larry King style microphone.
I like it just because it sounds good.
Good.
It's a very expensive condenser, and it makes me sound better than what I really do. So I can always use that help.
Yeah.
Now, you were a state senator for many years, weren't you, Vince?
I served in the Vermont Senate for 32 years. I was elected the same night as Ronald Reagan.
Is that right?
So that gives you a date stamp on just how long ago it was. And of course, Nancy Reagan just died several days ago. Mm-hmm. So kind of an end of an era on that family's part. But nonetheless, I started with Ronald Reagan. We got elected the same night, and then I served for 32 continuous years in the Senate, and really made a lot of friends. Hopefully, did a lot of good for the area. Mm-hmm. And
you saw a lot of governors too.
Saw a lot of governors. Started with Dick Snelling.
Right, I remember Dick.
Madeline Kunin. Then we moved on to
Howard Dean.
Then, Dick Snelling had come back. Then Howard Dean, and then Jim Douglas, and now Peter Shumlin.
Yeah. So you've had quite a few governors to work with.
Yep. Yeah.
Were there any of them that were easier to work with, or not as easy to work with?
Well, I served in the Senate with Peter Shumlin for quite a while. He got elected to the Senate in the 2000s. Mm-hmm. And of course, I knew him when he served in the House. He served starting in the early 1990s. So we were pretty good friends. The Senate's a fairly small group of people. Mm-hmm. But it was, everyone had, not only did you work with the governor, but you worked with their executive staff. So there was a lot of differences there. It was, Dick Snelling, the businessman, Madeline Kunin, the tax and spend liberal, and Howard Dean, even though when he ran for president portrayed himself as a lefty, a liberal, he in fact was a very conservative governor, held down spending, and really was different than what he portrayed himself when he ran for the Democratic presidential nomination.
Oh, okay.
But great guy. We all had, I got along with all of them, and hopefully they got along with me, and we got a lot of good things done.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up, Vince, that you guys worked together.
Right.
Regardless of your party. And that seems to be lost in Washington today, isn't it?
Right. In Washington, it's really a partisan game. When you have the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, you basically follow their lead in Washington. And there is really no deviation. In Vermont, it's still, by and large, an issue-oriented debate and vote. Mm-hmm. You don't have a majority leader dictating to the members of that party how they're going to vote on an issue. And you don't have repercussions if you fall out of line. So you see in Vermont, although by and large the votes are along party line, there are exceptions, and that's expected and welcomed. It gives more diversity, it helps the bill to be better vetted, and often results in a better outcome.
Last year, my granddaughter graduated from UVM, and one of their guest speakers said something interesting about Vermont politics. They said the Republicans act like Democrats, the Democrats act like liberals, liberals act like progressives.
Right.
Does that sort of sum it up?
That's right. We're sort of left of center in Vermont. Mm-hmm. I'd say, I served as a Republican, and then in my later years as a Republican and Democrat, I used to get both nominations. Mm-hmm. But I'd say Vermont Republicans would be akin to moderate Democrats in most other places in the country. Mm-hmm. So Vermont is a much more liberal state on a number of social issues. Mm-hmm. Criminal justice, for example. If you commit a crime in New Hampshire and you're relatively young, you're probably going to go to jail for a year or two. Mm-hmm. In Vermont, it's more focused on rehabilitation. What's the underlying factors that caused this errant behavior, and how can we prevent it in the future? So we give particularly young folks, a second and third chance sometimes.
Yes, and you know as well as I do, prisons really don't reform people very well. The recidivism rate is always fairly high.
Right.
So it's actually better, because I worked in the drug and alcohol rehab unit at Northern State for 4 years, and the idea was to try to rehabilitate.
Right. That's exactly right. We put a lot of money in prevention and then rehabilitation. It's interesting, Vermont does send some offenders out of state.
Right, yes.
And by and large, they learn how to become professional criminals.
Exactly.
They come back with tattoos, they come back with a mindset which is worse than when they left. Mm-hmm. So joining Vermont prisoners with out-of-state prisoners in out-of-state placements, I'm not sure serves the state well in the long run. It may save you a little money up front, but in the long run, it really brings additional financial and social burdens back to Vermont.
When I was there, they were sending them to Virginia. Where are they going now?
Well, I think we have Michigan now. We got the low bid from Michigan. And there's scattering in other places. I think Louisiana. Mm-hmm. So, they were in Kentucky for a very long time, but that contract, I think, has been terminated. Mm-hmm.
Now, what are you doing now, Vince? You got a couple different things you do now. I know you're prosecuting attorney, correct?
Right. I'm the Essex County States Attorney, which is one of the 14 elected county attorneys in Vermont. I have a private practice in Orleans, mm-hmm. and I'm now also a lobbyist at the State House. So I represent the Vermont State Employees Association, which is about 54 to 5,500 members. I also represent the 14 elected sheriffs. Each county has a sheriff, and they formed the Vermont Sheriff's Association. Mm-hmm. So I help them a little bit, part-time. And so among those different activities, it keeps you busy.
Yeah, I would say so. You said, how many people do you lobby for now?
Well, the VSCA is the Vermont State Employees Association. Okay. So it represents corrections workers, Department of Children and Families, DCF. By and large, the executive workforce. Mm-hmm. And so there's about 54 to 5,500 statewide, including some folks here in Newport, the Agency of Transportation. It's all the entities of state government.
So do you meet with a lot of different people?
Well, we don't really, because there's a hierarchy at VSCA. There's a board of trustees. There's a legislative committee. Okay. And so we primarily meet with the folks who are designated a particular bill or to work on legislation. There's a pension committee, there's a health advisory committee, and then there's a legislative committee. So I primarily work with the legislative committee and the board of trustees.
Mm-hmm. Now, where did you go to college to become a lawyer?
I went to Vermont Law School.
Oh, okay.
Which is in South Royalton.
And now it takes, 7 years to get it, as a JD?
A JD. It was 7 years when I do it now, but now there's been somewhat of a transformation in some parts of the country where you can get a JD in 2 years, and then there are some programs which are developing around the country whereby you can now merge college and law school together and get both done in 6 years. It may be 5 years. I haven't seen the latest iterations, but it's an attempt to save some money and get the same basic education from both your college and law school.
So the way it used to work was you'd have to go 4 years to get your bachelor's degree.
Correct.
Then you'd have 3 years and you'd get your JD.
Correct.
Which is the equivalent of a PhD, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Juris Doctorate. It's a doctorate degree.
Yeah, so in other words, you'd skip the master's degree and you'd go right to the doctorate, correct?
Well, you would get a doctorate in 3 years.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So now how they're streamlining this down to 6 years?
Well, some areas are trying to integrate your college education with the law school education, so you can do it and save a year and save some money. I mean, some of these law schools are fairly expensive. You're talking $40,000 to $50,000 you can save.
Yeah, especially a place like a Harvard Law School.
Right.
Or Dartmouth Law School or someplace like that.
Yeah, Dartmouth doesn't have one. In fact, there's been talk over the years of having Vermont Law School merge with Dartmouth, or have Vermont Law School merge with UVM.
That might be a smart idea.
Yeah, well, they're thinking about it. It hasn't been completely ruled out, but it's been discussed back and forth for the last 10 years.
Really? That's something I'd like to see done.
Yeah.
Because anytime you can pool resources, it's only going to make things better, I think.
Absolutely. Plus, it gives you the institutional backing. Vermont Law School is a small school, relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
If you merge it with UVM or Dartmouth, then you've got the financial strength and the backbone of that institution, which have been around for a couple hundred years.
Yeah, and who wouldn't want a degree from Dartmouth?
Right. I mean, yeah,
or
sure.
from UVM, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, Vermont Law School's got a good reputation across America, primarily for environmental law, because Vermont's known for its environmental protection and activism, if you will. So getting a degree from Vermont Law School is not getting a degree from Harvard, but nonetheless it does carry some weight if you're going into specialty areas of the law like environmental protection.
Yeah, and I think that is extremely important. We try to protect the environment here in Vermont, unlike some other states, and you can see it in the quality of life. As a matter of fact, Vermont now ranks second healthiest in the country.
Right.
Only behind Hawaii.
Right. Well, I was in Florida first week of March, and the environmental problems down there are significant. They have developed. They've really overdeveloped the state, and so there's evidence now that like the alligators are not receiving sufficient food. They're basically starving. The Everglades, the flow of water that used to feed nutrients to the animals and the flora and the fauna is not coming through because they've built roads and dams to support the growing population. You have the United States Sugar Corporation, which is based in the central part of the state, which still openly burns the plants at the end of the growing season, resulting in air pollution and water pollution. You have Lake Okeechobee, which I think was a man-made lake the size of the state of Rhode Island, which is now polluted. And every time they let water flow, it causes further environmental damage into the rivers and streams that it flows to. So they have a boatload of problems. When they developed the state, a lot of people made a lot of money. Now they're paying the price for it.
Yeah, and that's really too bad that so much of that is money driven. It's all just to make a buck, and then
Right.
we have to end up paying for the fallout from all of it.
That's right.
Now, you told me something I didn't realize, but you were on Larry King once.
That's right. The reason I mentioned it is that microphone you're using is similar to what Larry King used to use.
Yeah, his I believe was a model. Well, his wasn't even plugged in.
That's right. He used to use the lapel mic, just like I have on right now. But I was on in the mid-1990s, and the long story is this. Back in 1987, I introduced the death penalty bill in Vermont. It was considered by the Senate, rejected. The compromise was life without parole in certain egregious circumstances. And so my thinking on that has evolved over the years. But there was a Vermonter on death row in Harris County. Harris County, Texas is where Houston is. And it's the county where the most death penalty cases come from in Texas. And what
is there any reason for that, do you think, Vince?
It's the elected prosecutor and the level of crime there.
Oh, okay, all right.
They use it as a deterrent, obviously, to the extent people believe that the death penalty is a deterrent. In any event, there was a Vermonter on death row in Texas. And shortly before his scheduled execution, I'll tell you what happened.
Please do, yeah. This is fascinating.
There were three individuals in a car, went to a 7-Eleven in Harris County, Texas, which is outside of, near Houston. And one of the men went into the store and shot the store attendant, the clerk behind the counter.
Mm-hmm.
So that person died. They were all charged with capital murder, and I think they're called district attorneys in Texas, said that they would be seeking the death penalty. The other two defendants, as I said, I think there were three of them. One was from Vermont. The other two were from other states. They entered into plea agreements where they pleaded to burglary or some reduced charge, and I recall one of them got a 15-year sentence. The Vermonter who was waiting in the car, his defense was, look, I didn't know they were going to go in there and shoot anybody. However, under the law, if you're the getaway car driver, then you're held to the same level of accountability as if you're the person that pulled the trigger and actually shot the store clerk. So just before his scheduled execution, the co-defendant, who had resolved his case and pleaded to burglary and got the 15-year sentence, he wrote an affidavit which stated that when they went into the store, they did not have a plan to kill anyone. They were simply going in there and they were going to try to steal some money.
Mm-hmm.
So the Vermonter that was on death row filed a motion for a new trial, and Texas denied it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was on Larry King saying, look, in the 1980s I had supported the death penalty, but it's cases like this that give even proponents of the death penalty pause, because there is evidence available which suggests that this person is either innocent or should not be punished with the death penalty. And so we were on the air. I was in Washington with Larry King in the studio at CNN, and they had a prosecutor on from Texas whose message was basically, it's great to hear these guys from Vermont talk about how they don't think this guy should be executed. Well, if they don't want their residents executed, they should commit their murders in Vermont, not Texas. And so it was a fairly tough position taken by the prosecutors in Harris County, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And that night, after we were on Larry King, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay of execution so that the federal courts could review whether there was merit to the statement by the co-defendant that the Vermonter had not known about any plan or intent to kill anyone during that armed robbery.
And so what was eventually the outcome to that?
Well, the courts went through the process. They determined that once the co-defendant had pleaded guilty, he had nothing to lose, so he could say anything he wanted. And his pretrial statements had implicated, he wasn't a Vermont resident at that time. He had grown up in Vermont and had moved away. The courts concluded that his statement was not credible because he only gave that statement after he had resolved his case, and there was nothing more the state of Texas could do to him.
Mm-hmm.
So they found it not credible, and he was executed several months later.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that you bring this up? And I wasn't expecting this interview to go this way, but I think you've tapped into something extremely important. We're the only industrialized nation that has a death penalty, or a democratic country. For example, Canada doesn't have this. None of your European countries have this, except maybe for Russia, but they don't have any of this.
Right.
Wouldn't
a number of countries do, but they're not the more advanced countries.
Which leads me to the next question. I just barely thought of this. You must be familiar with Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld.
Well, I know the names.
Yeah. Then they have set free many men in prisons
Right.
from DNA evidence that could not have committed the crimes that they were convicted of,
That's
correct?
correct, yep. And in Vermont, we passed a law that allows for the use of DNA in closed cases if it's available to review whether there is a proper conviction. As you know, most cases settle by plea agreement. Very few go to trial.
Right.
And of the ones that go to trial, if the person continues to maintain his or her innocence, then we did set up a protocol whereby any available DNA can be tested.
Well, I think that's a good idea because obviously you don't want to execute the wrong man or woman for that matter.
Well, we don't execute in Vermont, but
Right.
you don't want to send somebody to jail for a long time or any time if they're not guilty of the offense.
But still, the idea of someone in prison, you can still, if something is overturned or reversed, you can spring them.
That's
if
exactly
you
right.
execute them, you can't do that.
That's exactly right.
You know?
And there are cases where people, watch on TV mass murders, and there's always that sense. There are some cases where it's really an open and shut case, but not all cases are open and shut. These days, some of these high-profile cases are on video. There are numerous witnesses. But that's not always the case. Oftentimes it's eyewitness testimony, which everyone understands is not the most reliable testimony in some cases.
Oh, absolutely. Videotapes don't lie.
Right.
But I even saw one on television where it looked like an officer had tackled somebody for no reason, and it turned out that there was a reverse angle that showed that the officer was actually attacked first.
Right.
So
even videos, you got to be careful.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So, you're in your present position as is it Essex?
Essex County States Attorney.
Okay. You prosecute civil and criminal, or just criminal?
Just criminal. I mean,
Just
there are
criminal.
some civil cases because we handle juvenile cases, we handle post-conviction relief actions,
Okay.
but by and large, they are criminal cases.
Okay. What agencies do you mostly work with right now?
Well, in Essex County, as far as police agencies, the Essex County Sheriff's Department, the Vermont State Police, the offices in Derby and St. Johnsbury, and Island Pond and Brighton have a part-time police department.
Okay.
That pretty much covers it as far as police agencies. We then work with the Department of Children and Family offices out of Newport and St. Johnsbury. And sometimes we work with school districts on truancy petitions. So there are various agencies, the Department of Fish and Wildlife regarding hunting and fishing violations. So by and large, we work with all agencies that have enforcement statutes that they are obligated to enforce. But by and large, it's the Sheriff's Department, the State Police, and the Brighton and Canaan Police Departments.
Okay. Now, lately there's been a lot of talk. Well, one of the things has been marijuana legalization.
Right.
Okay. Where do you feel comfortable talking about that or not?
Well, I've always, if I've never been a big fan of legalizing marijuana.
Right.
Several years ago, there was a bill to legalize medical marijuana, and I stood on the floor of the Senate and said there is no such thing as medical marijuana. It's all the same stuff.
Right.
It's how you choose to characterize it.
Exactly.
And back then, the advocates for marijuana actually publicly had on their websites that we're going to call this medical marijuana, but it's really to get our nose under the tent so we can then proceed to legalize marijuana across the board.
Right.
But the statistics coming out of Washington and Oregon suggest that now that it has been legalized there, younger folks are beginning to abuse drugs more so than they did prior to those laws being put into effect.
Colorado also?
Colorado and Washington. Did I say, or I said Colorado, Oregon, and Washington?
Yeah, those are the
I
big
believe
three
those
right
are the three.
Yeah, and there is a difference between decriminalization and legalization.
That's
of course.
right. Now, Vermont does have, if you have 1 ounce or less of marijuana, it's a civil violation.
Right.
In those states, it's legal. You can actually walk into a store and purchase it.
Yeah,
In Vermont, there are some very wealthy business owners in Vermont who hired lobbyists to promote the marijuana legalization bill in Vermont because they see this as an opportunity to make some big money.
Oh, of course, yes.
And so you've got those folks pushing for it. You have those who really think it should be legalized for whatever social reasons. And so you have a number of Vermonters, including the governor, received campaign contributions from groups that want to legalize marijuana. So there was some pressure on to get the bill moving. And what happened is that there were so many nuances, so many unanswered questions, that what the Senate did is pass a bill which essentially delegates the authority to the Department of Public Safety. They couldn't write a framework of legislation in the short time that the legislature meets, which is 4 months a year. And on the Senate side, committees only meet for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. It's pretty hard to write a comprehensive piece of legislation in such a short time span.
Yeah, I would agree. And it seems to me they went through the same thing with prohibition back in the 20s.
Right, that's right.
And it was repealed because businessmen said, hey, we're tired of paying taxes and we want you to re-legalize this so we can make money on it.
Correct.
And some people are saying that legalization of marijuana and state-sponsored would make money for the state. However, I look at it, see, I was a drug and alcohol counselor.
Right.
I see this as a double-edged sword. You're going to get rid of some problems, but you're going to create new ones.
Right.
And people really should take a hard look at this, because you know as well as I do, as soon as you legalize something, people are saying, oh, it's safe, when in fact it isn't.
Right. You have to be careful, and it also sends somewhat of a mixed message. We have a serious drug problem in Vermont, particularly with narcotics.
I was going to ask you about the heroin issue, yeah.
So to young folks, it sends somewhat of a mixed message, say no to drugs, but marijuana is okay. And as I said, they're experiencing some issues in the states that legalized it, I believe by referendum. Voter referendums where advertising dollars were used to buy TV ads and convince the voters that this is a good thing to do.
Well, I'll even take it a step further. I see alcohol as a very bad thing also, and that gets abused and that causes problems. But since that's part of our European culture, there's probably not going to be any getting rid of that. But I would agree, you're going to have problems either way you go with this.
Right. As state's attorney, the big issues that we find are precipitating factors for a lot of the offenses, particularly the burglaries, the break-ins, that kind of thing, are addiction to narcotics,
right,
heroin, and the need to satisfy that addiction. And then alcohol abuse causes a lot of crime. And then there's folks who have a mental health condition. So those are the three big factors that by and large play a role in almost every offender case that comes forward. Alcohol abuse, drug abuse, addiction, and mental health.
Vince, I want to tell you, our time is just about up. We're going to have to do this again. Okay. Because we covered far more than I thought we were going to cover, and I know you've probably got 1,000 more stories you could tell me.
Oh, I can tell you a lot of stories. A lot of fun stories, too.
Good. We will definitely have to do this again. Now that you're not a legislator, do you have more free time or less free time?
Well, it's not more free time. It's free time. It's time used in different ways. Because I'm still at the State House. Okay. And a lot of lobbying takes place at nighttime. You talk to people when they're not in the pressure cooker of the State House, being bombarded with information from 20 different sources at the same time. So it's better to do it one-on-one, and it's easier to explain it. It's easier to understand it on the receiving end, and so it requires that kind of work. But I find that based on my experience, that's the best way to communicate with a legislator, and that is in the evening when there isn't a lot of hubbub at the State House, and you can actually communicate clearly and answer questions so that there's not a dozen people watching. trying to figure out who's on what base, that kind of thing.
I want to thank you again, Vince. And like I said, we'll have to do this again in a few months. And it was great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. It's good to see you.
This is Terry Difazio for Dial It Up saying we'll catch you on the flip side and have a good day.